Hi, this is Richard Grieco for RunItOnce.com, and this can be part 10, the concluding part of my 10k scoop PLO MTT review. We're going to be somewhere around here at the moment, depending on whether there are 6 or 5 players at the other table, so kind of on a little bit of a pay jump most likely, and then pretty close to making the final table. You can dive straight into the action. Folds around to us. I think this is a limp against Uberschirms. He's going to do a decent job of defending versus RFI, and our hand does not play well in a raised pot out of position. Kind of just wants to control the pot size, I think. Did find something interesting when I took a look at this spot in a pre-flop sim. If I create a hand class for kind of stuff that resembles my combination, so tri-suited kings without another Broadway card and or without like a picture card or an ace and with a wheel card. What we seem to be doing is opening the combinations with 2 low cards because they're often more connected. So like the King 6-5, King 5-3, that kind of thing. And then the King 10s, the King 9s, these are mostly limping. What's interesting is that versus limp, imposition is in theory ISOing 33%, which is I think broadly what I expect Uberschirms to play, maybe slightly tighter given the context of the situation, not by very much. And we're going for the limp re-raise with these hands, which is more aggressive than I'd have instinctively thought we wanted to be. But clearly, like as stacks shallow out, just the value of having high pairs increases irrespective of kind of like the quality of the side cards. We do go with limp. Honestly, in game, I'm sure I was playing the limp call, but interesting to know. Definitely not inclined to start betting on this flop, or this turn, or this river. So we check it down and beat 9x, which seems very standardly played. Next up, very clear RFI with the Rainbow Kings. Not really doing much limping in position with Rainbow hands because they have very bad post-flop playability, basically, so guaranteeing that you see a flop is kind of an inefficient range to put them in. Mads calls, and I don't think we go too far wrong just having pure c-bet on this board. Even from the button, there's going to be a large range asymmetry on the ace-high boards, given the size of my pre-flop open. You know, if I have some limps, then I'm going to have a tighter range than I would if I were playing raise only, and he's going to be defending pretty wide, as we've seen in other stuff before. We go with small bet. And get called. Turn we have blockers, we have the King of Diamonds, board pair which gives us gut shot for equity. I actually think the 9's kind of neutral. Like it gives us equity, but it also blocks folds. Like if we bet, then a lot of the hands that we're targeting are, 10-9, ace-9. I think we're giving up some king-king combinations here because like there are kings and there are jacks as straight blockers, and jacks obviously block both straight, so I'm being a lot more aggressive with those, I would think. Kings will also have like very, very slightly higher EV in the check line. I think this hand mainly wants to barrel through. King of Diamonds is a little bit nice. 9 isn't great, but like the equity kind of cancels out the removal effects. I also think that Mads might fold this spot. Like, not crazily tight, but not be as sticky as he might be against double barrel in a cash game. And I have a hand that is pretty good at following through. At least at some frequency. So yeah, I think I'm meant to double barrel here. But we kind of chicken out and get hit with big bet on the river. And to this action, I would assume that this line is super value heavy. So we have our hand, so we have a pretty clear fold, but I would probably be overfolding that spot anyway. We open, which seems a little bit loose from the cutoff, probably be okay-ish from the button. I mean, as always, the caveat of if we anticipate reduced pre-flop aggression, then light opens get some amount better. But there is Mads in the small blind who can put a fair amount of pressure on us. If we flip Mads and my stacks, then this open gets close to standard, I think. We get defended, and I think we get a lot of c-bet on this board. Again, considering pre-flop range versus range interactions, our hand doesn't massively benefit from betting. So if I were checking back like 25% of the time, this hand might be in that 25% because I have showdown value, I have a backdoor nut flush draw, which it really sucks to get check raised off. On the other hand, I think I'm just getting pure c-bet or close to pure c-bet on a texture like this, or at least I don't lose much by playing pure c-bet. And I would expect, like, if I were to bet this board and run it through a solver, then out of position would start check raising, in the double figures. I would imagine, given the context of the situation, people are just going to be playing low variance lines, and not even just incorrectly, just as a reaction to the increasing divergence between chip and dollar EV. We go with small c-bet. I don't hate it. If I'd open button, maybe I want some checks because my range is weaker and so on and so forth. No particular reason to bet turn. I beat a fair amount of stuff. Obviously no better hand is folding. And very similar thing on the river. And this hand probably just mainly check calls in a cash game environment. But with this SPR, at some frequency, hands like this are probably meant to be check raising flop with a 10 and top 2 and stuff. It will be at least close. And if this hand is absolutely never check raising on flop, then betting this hand gets a fair amount better. Small under the gun open, we defend. We have a rainbow hand, but we have pretty solid connectivity and obviously an ace high hand. Flop trips on the driest board in the world, essentially. Ubershem's bets one big blind, which I actually think is a really good bet size. Even betting third pot here is not really effective. Well, it might be effective, it's not efficient. And this sizing just puts me in a little bit of a tough spot with some stuff. I have to dig deeper into my range to find more marginal defends that would be tougher to play on future streets. This bet on this board exemplifies the difference between picking a sizing that makes your opponent fold at a high frequency and picking a sizing that's actually maximizing your EV. Betting one big blind with your entire range here is, I would bet money that even if you could construct a strategy that was minutely better for equilibrium EV, this would be losing a fraction of 1%. So something to keep in mind. This board is very easy to have this bet size on. I think you can apply it even on a few others with slightly less dry characteristics. Turn checks through. And River's kind of interesting. Given his flop sizing, his flop sizing in a way does me a favor here because it makes me continue enough stuff, worse than pocket tens or so, that I am actually going to have bluffs in this situation. It's almost tougher to play if he bets bigger on flop, and now I'm kind of desperately searching to find some bluffs to play a balanced strategy, or trying to figure out how to deal with the fact that I just have a range that doesn't really contain a bluff region and how that should impact things. There's some duplication in my hand between cards I'll have with my bluffs and cards I have now with ace X. I would imagine that I'm bluffing my mid pairs at some frequency, like 8s and 7s. I think this is an interesting spot to look at in the solver because it's a little bit of an odd one to try and navigate. It's a fair amount easier from the imposition perspective, which means I expect Ubershirms to get pretty close to what he's meant to be doing here. And that should give solver-generated insights some pretty high validity. So firstly, if we create a potential bluffing region of worse than 10s, we're going to have these hands 12% of the time, which given that we're not going to want to bet at a crazy high frequency, and given that we're going to mainly pick a smaller sizing, which is going to mean that we have to have a pretty high value to bluff ratio, actually helps us play a relatively balanced strategy. We are actually turning a few hands better than 10s into bluffs, like, for example, King, Queen, 10, 10. The presence of Broadway cards is going to have a pretty significant effect on our overall strategy, basically. The idea being that they have blocker effects on impositions, bluff catchers. So a hand like King, Queen, 10, 10 might not seem like it gains very much by betting, like it doesn't fold out better at a particularly high frequency. Mainly it's about, like if we have a 10-10 combination, mainly it's about not getting bluffed or preempting getting bluffed. Like if we check and they bet, we're mainly folding. So it almost functions in Solverland as kind of a block bet. Obviously, that relies on you thinking imposition can check back some ace-x on turn and probably value bet some 9x on river and maybe even value bet some stuff like king-king. In any event, so our bluffs tend to be less focused on the rank of our hand and more focused on the presence or absence of Broadway cards. So, like, for example, if I say we have worse than pocket jacks, we're betting roughly half the time, and these can all be thought of as bluffs. If I add a king, then that frequency shoots up to 80%. If I add a queen, similar effect. If I add king, queen, then obviously it compounds and we're bluffing basically all of the time. There's a lot of betting with our weaker ace-x, precisely because then that means we don't have ace-king, ace-queen, so we can get called more easily. So an ace without better than ace-queen, for example, is essentially always betting. If we have ace-king, ace-queen, then we mix in quite a few checks. And that's not only because we block their calls, it's also because our ace-x now becomes strong enough to check raise. So like ace-king, ace-queen, without better than pocket sixes. So we check, they bet. And we're doing quite a lot of check raising over here. So what that all basically comes down to is if we have a hand with, like, if we have a low pair, then we're usually bluffing it, like a hand like 5-4-4-3, let's say. Bunch of low cards, doesn't beat anything in check line, so on and so forth. If we have a mid pair, a little bit more showdown value, then we're mixing based on how good our bluff, how effectively we block our opponent's bluff catching range. And if we have like an ace-x, then we're basically always betting if we don't block their potential bluff catchers. So our hand is meant to be more or less pure bet. In game, I would imagine I was a little bit befuddled and just went with check. I don't really like this. I don't really see, like, am I trying to induce a bluff? That doesn't seem great. Yeah, this seems slightly clumsy. And yeah, he has one of the hands that I unblock and might have paid off. So that's a little bit disappointing. We can maybe limp this hand into Mads with a covering stack. Depends a little bit on bubble dynamics. Like if we're on a pure bubble and he's playing very aggressively, then I think limping is pretty decent. If he's just playing like a vaguely normal style, then opening like kings with a king high suit and another Broadway card has to be, reasonable. Flop I like checking, no flush draw, no backdoor flush draw. Backdoor straight draw, which obviously we don't want to get check raised off. We also block the hand immediately below us, so like if we have kings, then part of the value is getting called by queens. So I imagine I would want a little bit more aggression if I was able to get called by more weaker hands. And the things I can just like open myself up to getting check raised. Like I'm very interested in controlling the size of the pot here, basically. I can delay c-bet turn, but very similar things apply. Like I'm never pretty much ever going to want to bet more than one street. It's kind of nice to just check this hand back and have a very easy call on a whole bunch of rivers. I can value bet some rivers. And in general terms, I just don't think I gain by tightening his range to one that V-pips against a delay c-bet. And as with before, I open myself up to getting check raised. Not going to be value betting that particular river. I mean, he probably calls jacks on turn. It's not even a fantastic spot with that particular combination. Depends on my sizing, I assume. Another spot against Uberschirms under the gun. Pretty easy check on turn, I think. If you know that someone's checking back the most ridiculously weak range in the world, then there's no particular harm in like blocking to maybe set up the ability to bet the jack of spades as a bluff on the river, or value bet an ace, stuff like that. But like this hand is just a supernatural check against someone who has a checking range that's reasonably constructed. And on river, I think we want kind of like a moderate sizing. We might be betting some queen high straights, but I'd imagine we're also checking a fair few. So mostly our value region is like our queen high straights are the best at getting paid off, then king jack plus, and that can support a reasonably large sizing. On the other hand, it's the kind of thing again where if we size too large, then we just make it very easy for him to defend. If we bet around half pot, then we're kind of pushing him towards indifference with a hand like Queen 5, I guess, which is kind of where I want to get to. Like, when I defend against under the gun, it also depends heavily on how wide I am pre-flop, because if I'm defending a tightish range against under the gun, then I find it very tough to show up with air on this river, and so I'm left with a version of the previous scenario where I'm just making small bets with a slightly expanded value range. If I have the ability to show up with bluffs here, if I'm defending like 3/4 of my range or whatever, then maybe I should size up and go a little bit more polar. Go like 40%, which seems pretty reasonable. Defend against Sir Watts. Not going to be printing EV, but as we've seen, we're just defending like, the vast majority of our range against these small opens, and we have some connectivity in a pair and so on and so forth. And flop versus small c-bet, we go with check raise. In theory, I'm pretty sure this isn't going to be a thing without a heart, because so many of his continues are going to be like Queen X and flush draw, King X, kings with a flush draw, and so on. I think otherwise, though, this is a reasonable combo choice. Like, definitely board pair plus like future straight blockers with a pocket pair is are characteristics that you would value in a check raise range. Because if he calls, I can barrel the straight completing cards. My 6 makes it harder for him to have 2-pair plus, and on this texture, he's kind of going to struggle to find 2-pair combinations already. It's not that he needs those hands in order to continue. Like, he can obviously continue Queen X and flush draws and whatever, but at least I know he won't have the very strongest made hands at a particularly high frequency. I think this is the kind of play that often actually works pretty well, though, kind of deeper into, well, in general, but particularly in this environment where people aren't like going after spots as aggressively as they may in like a cash game. That can, I mean, we've seen a few instances of me kind of lazily c-betting, assuming reduced resistance on the part of my opponent, and this is just me kind of taking the flip side of that perspective. So backdoor flush draw, board pair, straight blockers. Check calling seems like not a great option, but my hand has some amount of merit. So yeah, I'm kind of fine with this. If I somehow knew he was c-betting like a solver approved range, then it gets questionable. But even if he's like c-betting a few percent more than he should, I think he starts to struggle to defend against this enough of the time that like I don't need it doesn't even have to work that often, because I'm laying myself better than even money, and if he calls, I have, it's not like I have 0 EV when he calls, basically. So I kind of like that, actually. We can limp this hand. Don't mind opening it. have to be, well, I don't want to overuse that logic. Like, ultimately, we have similar stack to Mads, and we have positional advantage, so it's not really a big deal. Solvers are kind of cautious about opening these kind of hands, but again, they anticipate more robust response. We get 3-bet, and now our hand, I think, is a must call. We just have too much connectivity, and against and his range, if I assume that it's a bit tighter than normal, is also quite well defined, and typically like doesn't duplicate. He doesn't duplicate my outs. Basically, there's very little domination going on the majority of the time. We call and flop trips. And Mads checks to us, which is pretty interesting because at SPR slightly under 2, I'm pretty sure he gets more or less pure C-bet here. He's doing a lot of checking on this board at, let's say, 100 big blind starting stacks in a cash game, because the fact that he's going to have a high density of overpairs, and I may, as the imposition player, have slightly more Jack-X combinations as a consequence of that. It's just going to force him to play a little more defensive. His overpairs at SPR2 can feel a lot happier about just betting, getting money in, or at least getting the money in some way, particularly on a two-tone board when they can bet and get continued against and still like have the best hand. So again, at 100 big blind starting stacks, we get a lot of big bet in this situation as the imposition player. Doesn't really benefit us to start betting small, given that out of position will just have so many like hands that can defend very easily. We'd prefer to kind of polarize immediately. Not necessarily just like make aces and kings fold immediately, but just initiate the process of decreasing their EV and be able to get, I think, basically all of the money in on the turn, or at least with one more street of betting. And that's the idea I was applying in this situation. Being conscious of the fact that the SPR was shallower, I decreased sizing slightly. Probably got like 2/3 or something in a deeper stack cash game. I think this is still probably a little bit on the large side, though. Keeping what we learned in the last episode in mind, the differences in the imposition strategy when they had an equity disadvantage but a polarity advantage, hand against Limmonster, there was a big difference in sizing preference between SPR2 and SPR4 as a consequence of not needing to use the large sizing in order to build the pot enough to be able to make an all-in bet on the next street. And that's also the case here. Like, I can just bet third pot and still be able to shove turns. It does depend a little bit on my perception of his checking range. Like, my perception, first of all, is his checking range kind of shouldn't exist. And so that can often mean one of two things. Either he's filling his checking range with very natural checks, like hands that just don't benefit from forcing the aggression for whatever reason, or he's checking very polar. And if he's checking very polar, then obviously sizing up does very poorly. If he's filling his checking range with, like, you know, weak queens, like ace, queen, queen, 5, no flush draw kind of thing, this sizing does reasonably. I think small probably still gets the EV, though. This might have been an example of, like, I'd learned something in the solver that I was trying to apply, but maybe didn't choose the best scenario in which to do so. Mads folds. We chip up to over the 2 million mark. Go with open here. I think this is reasonable. Get to open a little bit wider, given one of the guys behind only has 6 big blinds. Like, if we were opening into 2 other 2 million chip stacks, probably have to be a little bit more cautious. This is a pretty decent opening hand, though. Quite, solid connectivity and so on and so forth. In the absence of blockers to 3-bet ranges, it ticks a few of the other boxes. And I can expect Mads to play a little bit cautiously in terms of 3-betting, although we've learned that line of reasoning has its limitations. But yeah, like, we're just going to play a little bit more cautiously against one another as a consequence of being 2 of the largest stacks at the table. Get it through. Opening the Ace King 7/7. doing a lot of c-betting in general, but this hand just like ticks none of the boxes wanting to do so. Beats some stuff and has no blockers to anything Kurat's going to continue with. Same thing applies on turn and on river. Well, on river it's gotten to the point where we're low enough in our range that we can maybe consider bluffing, but in general terms, like on a board like this, you're going to want diamonds and pair blockers basically. And my combination has 0. It beats some 6x. I mean, 6x really should be bluffing. I don't know if it is. Yeah, I don't know what EV my hand should or does have as a check, but like it's just an awful betting candidate. And yeah, I think just check back and hope I somehow win. And yeah, my bets would be like, you know, ace king of diamonds, as in ace x king of diamonds, 5-3, like that kind of thing, like stacking pair blockers and flush draw or flush blockers. And generally speaking, like pocket pairs and a bunch of stuff that just doesn't interact with the board aren't going to be particularly frequently bluffed, especially when he's just going to be checking like every 2 pair and never folding it kind of thing. This is probably on the loose side under most circumstances, but again, like we're 4-handed now, so probably we're somewhere around here. We could even be on the final table bubble. In fact, we basically have to be. Well, we can be anywhere from 9 to. We can be 9 or 8-handed, I guess, or 9 or 7-handed. We actually can't be 7 left because the final table was 7-handed. So we're going to be on some kind of a pay jump, most likely. Check back flop is okay. Like I don't hate the Uberschem strategy of just bet one big blind with range. Like this hand doesn't accomplish a great deal as a bet, but like if I bet one big blind, so what has to continue quite a bit of ace x. I mean, I block ace x, which might have been part of my thought process. Like I'm trying to get called by stuff like ace queen. It is a danger, as I think I've alluded to before. Like I'm probably betting a lot of the time on this board, and if you're building a small checking range, the last thing you want to do is fill it with hands that want to very naturally check, otherwise you end up with a somewhat clearly defined range. Once I've started checking, no reason to do anything else, and same thing on the river. I think this hand is probably meant to bluff. Some of the mid-pocket pairs, well, I guess he blocks me having mid-pocket pairs that check back, but like hands that I would check back twice sometimes and then call river would be like 8, 7, 6s, so he makes it a little bit more likely that I have like ace jack or something that he can maybe get to fold. I think in his shoes on the river, this is a decent spot to bet large. Be interesting. I mean, like a trips board, blind versus blind, where pre-flop ranges are way out of whack and whatever is kind of tough to analyze, but his hand just instinctively strikes me as one that wants to bluff. Like, it has no EV in the check line. If it's somehow the best hand, I'm basically always bluffing. When I check back flop, queen high is almost never the best hand on this run out. And yeah, it has some reasonable characteristics that might make it want to bluff. Reasonable open. Again, I assume we're on bubble. This will be, I think, clearly a better limp for chips, but I mean, Mads can just call in position and stuff, so I don't want to over-apply that logic. It's not like it's like a 100k bubble or something, but I assume I'm just turning all my marginal, all the hands that are like probably slightly better limps than RFIs. I'm just turning those hands into opens given the overall situation. I'm mostly fine with that, I think. This hand kind of the same thing, but this hand's a pretty decent open anyway. Like the ace 10 combination is pretty high value. Also a 10, like a single suit with a 10 high suit does well as an open because like I can knock out Mads with some random hand that has queen high hearts, like that kind of thing. And we're now at the final table. And since it seems sadly unlikely that I manage to bust 5 people in the next 4 hands, may as well take a look to round out the series at where it all went wrong. pretty reasonable open. Like, I'm pretty tight in this position. 2 big stacks to my left. Obviously, Jeans is out of position to me this particular hand. But the way the stacks are laid out, like, these guys are all clearly shorter than me. So I'm like a mid-stack out of position to big stacks. Just generally disincentivized from V-pipping wide at all, but this hand is just clearly an open chips. And once I open and get it through button, I can leverage pressure on Courage to an extent because he's somewhat incentivized to try and outlast one out of Mads and Sawats. And on the flop, we go with bet, and I kind of remember that I was thinking, I was thinking to pick a size of disincentivize action, basically. Because this hand is strong enough to get it in, but not fantastic at playing like a whole bunch of future streets. I'd prefer to just pick the pot up immediately, chip up a little bit, and move on with my life. Looks like checking flop back is more of a thing than I was potentially conscious of across a whole range of similar textures, kind of like some high cards and pretty dynamic. Like so Jack 10 here, if I just exclude the sets and the 3 pair combinations, but take out all the flush draw and backdoor flush draws, we start checking like 3/4 of the time. Similar board with the same characteristics. Queen 10's checking half the time. Same, kind of similar board, a little bit more sort of mid-connected. Jack 8's checking over half the time. Much heavier Broadway board. King Queen's checking half. So, like, there's a pretty clear trend. Some level of interest in checking back weak top pair combinations. It's nice, for example, to be able to check back Jack 10 here and like they probe a brick turn and you have shoves basically, which at SPR 4 is going to be a thing. Here the SPR is slightly larger, but it's not going to make so that we suddenly shift from 76% check to like 100% bet. Looking through the hands that want to check the most, like one trend that I noticed is that the strong draws are basically always betting. So, like, for example, if we said we have a hand like King, Queen, Jack 10, well, that's just always betting because it's just too strong. But once we get past those to kind of like the average draws, like bad gut shot hands, for example, Jack 10, 9-7, Jack 10, 8-7, these are basically all pure check. Jack 10, yeah. So these two hands are basically all pure check, and see kind of similar things on the other boards too, like the Ace King Queen 10, the King Queen Jack 10, like those kind of hands. Those are just pure bet. But once we go down to like the Queen 10 9-6s, like so it has a straight draw, but it's non-nutted. So potentially we gain more from keeping our opponent's range wide. We just have a whole lot of interest in checking back. Like it's just really nice here. I check back and Courage probes. You know, the 4 of spades turn for pot or for any sizing, and I just have raises. I was also thinking most likely that Courage isn't going to get super out of line here because he's still relatively close to these two guys. But the thing is, like, I'm not particularly incentivized to get into a massive confrontation either. Like pulling up the payouts and going to where we are now. So the payouts are pretty flat. Like second is 3/4 of first, third is over half of first, like that kind of thing. So this is pretty clearly a spot where I don't I gain by playing a slightly more patient, low variance approach, basically. Obviously, the whole idea of checking back a lot of top 2 pair is somewhat predicated on out of position having like an aggressive response strategy, like doing a lot of check raising. But it's not even like we lose by out of position check raising here, because like we'd rather they do that than they check call and the turn is like any diamond or a queen or whatever, anything but a complete brick. So I'm not sure out of position not doing that much check raising or doing slightly less check raising than equilibrium actually benefits or sizably increases the EV of betting. And even if it does, like I said, I think that's going to be counterbalanced by the different incentives that the payout structure creates. And our hand plays fine on turn. in a check through in a whole bunch of cases. We do go with big bet. We do get check raised. I mean, I want to say that I'm pretty sure that I'm not suddenly deciding that I should check back because of like a bias that occurred because we got check raised and we ran it for 3 million, and on the turn being three of diamonds, I mean, it's already kind of pretty clearly bad news. But I do think that as a consequence of the overall tournament situation, it's a pretty valid concept to apply here. So yeah, in retrospect, I think it's a pretty clear check. You know, if we have our hand with a backdoor flush draw or our hand with a front door flush blocker even, EV of betting just goes up a lot. Onwards and upwards. So Jeans opens, we're now, like, we have half the next shortest stack, more or less, so we're just playing chip EV, and chip EV involves defending a lot against smallish opens. This hand, I think, makes the cut pretty easily. King, Queen typically VPips quite a lot. And here I think we have very easy jam. SPR's 2. Flop isn't great for Jeans. I mean, he can obviously have, like, 8x and a flush draw, or overpair and flush draw, like, whatever. But we have enough of a hand to get the money in, and I think checking is clearly the best way in which to do so. We also, like, Jeans is going to be folding a little bit tighter against us in this spot than he would in cash game, because he doesn't have much interest in, like, getting into a thin spot for, like, what would be like a 1.5 million pot. In a situation where he might be winning, like, you know, 1% of the pot. I'd imagine if that were his assessment, he'd just opt to fold. Very easy 3-bet. Ace Jack 10 with a nut suit. And we get it through. Back up over 1 million. Opening into Sawat's big blind. He defends. We flop an inside wrap. And basically how this works is we have no interest in betting our hand, in theory, when it has like 10s, 9s, 8s. If we don't have a jack or a 7 or a flush draw, we just lose all interest in betting our hand, because we have quite high EV in the check line, but we don't block any of his strongest hands, basically. We don't block a diamond, like the nut flush draw. We obviously don't block jacks and 7s for bigger pairs. We do beat like all the unpaired stuff, obviously, and we have like some pretty nice turns. Like we check back and it rolls off the 9 of hearts. That's not a turn that Sawat's will likely consider as being that good for our range. So yeah, we have pure check here. On the turn, we go with smallish delay c-bet. This is kind of bad, I think. Like, you don't bet turn, or there's no incentive for me to bet turn for the same reason there isn't really an incentive for me to bet flop. Like, I beat a bunch of the stuff that's folding. I have some relatively high EV and somewhat deceptive rivers. I have other hands that with better bluffing characteristics, like lower EV in the check line or better blockers to his continues. When I don't have a diamond, a jack or a 7, he can just have like queens or whatever and be checking again, so I can value town myself pretty easily. And we get hit with check raise. And now, I mean, we've got ourselves into a spot that we should never be in. Our hand is pure check on turn. As played, it's kind of close, I think. Like, I would expect this spot to get slightly underbluffed, but not by a crazy amount. I mean, Sawat's is still fundamentally a very, very tough opponent. I feel like this hand just about gets to be a call, getting 4-1, but it is super close. I mean, I do block a lot of my own outs. I feel like calling and seeing a river is not the worst line. Basically, the fact that I now have a super close decision is a big part of why betting turn is clearly bad. As played, we go ahead and call, which, like, I think it's super close, so I don't hate either option once I bet, but I just should not have put myself in that situation. And we river a straight, he shoves. Now I think I actually have a pretty clear call. I unblock the flush draw bluffs. I have a hand that he could even be conceivably value betting if he's check raised a 9-8 semi-bluff combination. The 10 removes some combinations of like 7x that check raised turn and now has a full house. He can even be shoving some 7x for value against my range, honestly, the way this action's gone. So I don't think I have an option on river besides calling. I don't think I'm doing any folding of like trips plus, basically. But he has ace king 6-6 for the turned underfull. Instinctively, obviously, my reaction was wish I'd bet flop, but not betting flop is fine. The error and calling off on river is also fine. The error is in getting myself to that node at the river by betting and then being in a close decision versus check raise on the turn. So yeah, pretty clear turn error. Okay-ish with the river line. I mean, dislike the outcome, but the idea of calling this hand, I think, is kind of just one you have to shrug and do. Okay, that's going to wrap up this MTT review. Hopefully everyone enjoyed the series. As always, questions, comments, feedback, all welcome in the thread below or elsewhere. And until next time, I'll be back with something new. This is Richard Grieco for runitonce.com. Take care.